I'm waiting for there to be a pause in the dings that mean people are joining in order I think they're slowing down now. I'll get started, and I'm sure we'll get some more people joining over the next few minutes. But I wanted to say thanks for coming. Welcome, everybody. It's so wonderful to see so many of you joining us from all across the province. I want to note that this meeting is being recorded, so it'll be shared for those who can't attend. And we'd appreciate it if you could keep your microphone muted during the presentation. My name's Jocelyn Badley. I'm one of the TAL staff organizing this speaker series. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year at TAL, and we're holding a series of these events throughout 2022 to celebrate, featuring speakers who will bring their knowledge and a wide variety of perspectives to a series of conversations about the future. So it's our hope that these approaches and this new information will help you plan for the future at your own libraries, for your staff, and as well as the library community in general in Alberta and for TAL itself. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, the Piikani, and the Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. We're grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who've gone before us. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Todd Hirsch. For over 20 years, Todd has worked as an economist at numerous organizations, including the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canada West Foundation, and the Bank of Canada. For almost a decade, he taught economics at the University of Calgary. Today, Todd is a vice president and the chief economist at ATB. He's the author of the book Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change. And he also hosts The Future Of, a podcast that explores how our economy and communities can not only brace for change, but embrace the opportunities it creates. We are so excited to have Todd here with us today to share his perspective. Thank you very much, Todd. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Jocelyn, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this symposium. It's wonderful to be with you, I believe, again, because I do think I've spoken to this group probably sometime well before COVID started. But I'm joining you this morning from Treaty 7 territory in what we now know as Calgary, but grew up as a child in Treaty 6 territory. And a story relevant, I guess, to libraries. I spent part of my early childhood in Wetaskiwin. And some of my earliest memories are going to the old public library with my sister in Wetaskiwin and taking out books about birds, I remember specifically. So, and libraries have always been a big part of my upbringing and my education. Spent a lot of time in, there used to be a library in the basement of Southgate Mall in Edmonton. I don't think it's there anymore. I don't know, it's been so many years, but I spent a lot of time there. And of course, now in Calgary, who doesn't love our new public library downtown? So libraries have always been a big part of my life. So I thank you very much for allowing me to join you this morning and share some of my thoughts about something else that is important to all of us, and that is the economy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And I think you can, Jocelyn, do you want to give me a verbal thumbs up that you can see this again? The changing the narrative?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
That's good. Great. The title of my presentation, Changing the Narrative, New Ways of Thinking About the Economy in 2022. I'm going to start, first of all, with, as I always like to start, with a story, because who doesn't love stories? This story is about a young couple that are starting out their life together, doing something which for them, growing up, was quite traditional, and that is to have a roast ham dinner during one of the holidays. So they get out the ham, they get out the roasting pan, and the young husband, he gets out a sharp knife and wanting to show off his culinary skills, and he slices off the tip of the ham. And his spouse asks him, why do you slice off the tip? And he said, well, that's just the way you have to prepare ham. That's the way my mother always did it. She would slice off the tip of the ham before it went in the roaster. So they were a little curious as to why you have to do this. So they called up his mother and they asked her, Mom, why do you have to slice off the tip of the ham? And she said, well, that's the way your grandmother always did it. And that's the way I learned how to bake a ham. You have to slice off the tip. So they didn't want to let this go. They actually called up the grandmother and they said, "Grandma, why is it that you always have to slice off the tip of the ham before you roast it?" And she said, "Well, dear, I never had a roasting pan big enough." I love this story. It's a cute little story, but I think it offers some really valuable lesson. And that is what happens when we get stuck in narratives. We get stuck in ways of doing things or ways of thinking about things that perhaps at one time had a practical reason, but in current times, that reason is no longer there. And notice, slicing off the tip of the ham, this was not a tradition. Traditions, I believe, can have a lot of value and a lot of purpose, but this was just something that was done 3 generations ago because of a very practical reason. Grandma didn't have a roasting pan big enough. But 3 generations later, they were still doing it and not really knowing why. So in the spirit of rethinking some of these narratives, I want to talk about 3 aspects of our economy here in Alberta that I think we need to rethink. Because in some ways, if we don't, it limits us and it prevents us from moving forward in 2022 and beyond. And then I'll wrap up my presentation with a brief outline of our current economic forecast for Alberta this year and next year. So jumping right in, the first narrative that I want to tackle is this story we tell ourselves that resources are the source of our wealth. If you were to ask anybody who's been in Alberta for more than 15 minutes, if you were to ask him or her, why is it that Alberta has traditionally been a very prosperous, wealthy province? They're likely to say, well, oil and gas. And for obvious reasons, I mean, we do have a lot of oil and gas, but I want to argue, in fact, that it's not oil and gas itself that is the source of our wealth, but rather it is something else. And in order to do that, I'm going to invoke a quote from the father of modern capitalism himself, Adam Smith, who wrote 250 years ago in The Wealth of Nations. He wrote, "It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased." Now, this is a really interesting statement coming from Adam Smith. Even he recognized 2.5 centuries ago that it's not the resource that is the source of wealth, but it's the labor that's applied to that resource. Now, with apologies to Mr. Smith, I'm going to break this quote down and replace certain words and phrases to give it more applicability to Alberta in 2022. We could rewrite this. It was not by oil or by natural gas, but by labor. And in place of that, I'm going to write productivity, creativity, innovation, and good ideas. That all the wealth of Alberta was originally created. I think this is actually the story that we need to relearn, or maybe some of us learn for the first time. It is not the oil and gas in the ground itself that is the source of our wealth, but rather the creative, innovative ideas that have been applied to those resources over the many decades and into the future. Many of you will know this now iconic t-shirt. You see this on billboards and on bumper stickers, the I Heart Canadian Oil and Gas. And our friends at the Canada Action Coalition who came up with this, they do a lot of good work in promoting the energy industry. But with apologies to the designer of this t-shirt, I'm going to tweak it just a little bit to give it in what I believe is more of a true sense of what the narrative is all about here. Rather than I love Canadian oil and gas, I'm going to say I love Canadian productivity, creativity, innovation, and great ideas in the oil and gas industry. Now, admittedly, it makes for a bit of a messier t-shirt, and maybe that's why they didn't design it this way. But I think this is a truer sense of what we need, how we need to think about our resource industry at all. And the difference between loving oil and gas and loving creative, innovative ideas, the difference is not trivial. The difference is actually very important. Because if what we really love and what we're really proud of is creative, innovative ideas, this is actually really good news for Alberta moving forward. We know we are in a transition economy. We know that we as a country, as a province, leaders around the world have committed to moving towards a net zero carbon future. And we have to do this very quickly. There's a consensus around the world at least of political leaders, including ours here in Canada and Alberta, that moving towards a net zero carbon future is not optional. We have to do this. The good news is this is where wealth creation around creative, innovative ideas comes into play. In fact, we have a lot of wealth to be created moving towards a net zero carbon future. Clean energy technologies and renewable energies, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end of the presentation. This is going to be the area of wealth creation moving forward. When we think about how our traditional oil and gas extraction over the last 50 or 60 years has led to such incredible wealth, but now in this transition economy, we need to shift. The good news is the creative, innovative ideas in clean energy technologies, that is what's going to propel us in our net zero carbon future and wealth creation along the way. So that's the first narrative that I wanted to tackle. It's not the oil and gas molecules in the ground that's the source of wealth, but rather the creative, innovative ideas in the industry. The second narrative that I want to tackle, pardon me, is this idea that you get a job to earn income. Now, unless you are a volunteer in the volunteer sector, and there are many people who are like that, but for most of the rest of us, if our employers stopped paying us, we would probably stop working. So I don't want to suggest that income is unimportant, but I do want to tackle the idea that it's the only factor when we think about our jobs. Some of you, if you ever took economics, had the misfortune of taking economics in university or high school even, you might recognize this kind of graph. This is something that came out of the 1950s and 1960s. Labor economists trying to model how the labor economics work. And it was assumed to be a pretty straightforward relationship. There were only two considerations for the workers: the number of leisure hours they had and the amount of money they earned per hour. And the relationship was a converse one. If the employer pays me more money per hour, I will give up hours of leisure. And if they pay me less, I will take more hours of leisure. And they came up with whole complicated models of how labor economics worked with only this variable, the number of leisure hours and the income per hour. But while that may have made some sense in the 50s and 60s, I don't think it's a complete way of thinking about our labor economics in 2022. And to make my case, I'm going to walk us through a timeline, the evolution of our work-life balance, to show how our relationships with our jobs and our careers has changed. 100 years timeline. Now, don't worry, we're not going to stop it every year. I'm going to skip through the decades, but let's start 100 years ago, 1922. This little graphic depicts the typical Canadian's lifespan. The early part of one's life would have been spent in education, but it was a pretty short period of time. In fact, 100 years ago, it was a minority of Canadians that even completed high school. More likely, it was maybe grade 8 or grade 10. But the minute you left school, you were expected to pick up a shovel or get on a tractor, and thus began a long, unbroken period of time called work, represented by the green bar. Retirement or leisure is the slim red bar at the end. I'll say more about that in just a minute. But it was a pretty straightforward lifespan here. Work was predominantly in factories, then a lot of it was on farms. 80% of Canadians 100 years ago lived and worked on farms. Most work was manual and physically intensive. And retirement, that red bar at the end, was a short period of time. Even 100 years ago, age 65 was conventionally thought of as retirement age. Now, that wasn't formalized until 1965, when the federal government introduced the Canada Pension Plan. But even in 1922, most people would have thought conventionally age 65 is when you retire, but they only picked age 65 as retirement because age 66 was life expectancy. So you see where this left most Canadians. On average, they had about a year to live after they stopped working, meaning half of them didn't even make it a full year. The idea of retirement, it was a short, kind of brutal period of one's life The reality was at age 65, you're probably just too sick or old or tired to keep working at all. So retirement 100 years ago was not the way we think about retirement today. It really wasn't time spent pursuing hobbies or spending time with the grandchildren or travel and golfing in the Caribbean. It was a pretty short period of time when really you were just too old or tired to keep working. Pretty brutal. Let's fast forward, 1945, just after the Second World War. Well, now you see education is a little bit longer as more and more Canadians were finishing high school. The Canadian economy was doing well just after the Second World War. We see retirement, that red bar at the end, is a little longer as Canadians are now living longer. But we start to see a new trend or a new characteristic in our work-life balance, and that is occasional bursts of unemployment. Now, remember, this comes after the decade of the 1930s, where unemployment was chronic. In 1940, the federal government introduced what they called at the time the Unemployment Insurance Program, which we now know today as employment insurance. But the program was designed to bridge these very short but occasional bursts of joblessness, as marked by those dark red lines. But those periods of time were expected or assumed to be relatively short, a matter of a few weeks. The factory you work in lays you off until you walk down the street and get a job at the next factory. So we start to see these bouts of unemployment, and we start to see some federal programs to assist those in joblessness as a new characteristic in our work-life balance. The 1960s to 1970s, well, education is even longer as more people are now entering post-secondary. You see perhaps a few more bouts of unemployment, the dark red bars, and retirement and leisure at the end of one's life is getting longer yet again as life expectancy continues to increase. Many more women were entering the job market in the 60s and 1970s. And a really important shift is this idea of career starting to take shape. It wasn't until the 60s and 70s, in fact, that the Canadian economy was affluent enough that workers actually had the luxury of asking themselves what it is they want to do. The idea of a career being aspirational, that you can choose what career path you want. We started to ask children, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know what, if you think about how crazy that question would have been in 1922, what people wanted to be was somebody with food in their stomach. That was it. There wasn't a lot of career aspiration 100 years ago. Even in the 1950s, I remember asking my father, he retired after 40 years in retail grocery, but he got his first job at age 17 at a grocery store in Camrose, picking up a broom and sweeping. This was 1955. He had left high school at age 17. And I asked him, and then he worked his way up 40 years later into senior management. And I asked him, Dad, why did you think you had an interest or a passion for retail grocery? And he kind of laughed and he said, you know, we didn't ask ourselves questions like that in the 50s. I needed a job. It was pretty simple. He needed a job. He got a job pushing a broom. You work your way up the ladder. That was the pattern in the 1950s. But by the 60s and 70s, we started to ask children and instill in them this sense of aspiration. You can do anything you want. You can choose what career path you want. Now, I think there's some implications for this because, in fact, for a lot of children growing up, they find out actually they couldn't be anything they wanted to, or those aspirational career paths. You know, how many kids in 1969, including me, wanted to be an astronaut? But we realized that those aspirational career paths may or may not be possible or practical. Nonetheless, it was the 60s and 70s when our relationship with our job took a big shift, being more aspirational and oriented around choosing a career. And retirement, as I mentioned, is a longer period of life as life expectancy increases. Let's fast forward to the 1980s and 1990s. Well, here we see more complexity. We start to see those red bars, the dark red bars of unemployment, some of them a little bit wider, as unemployment can become chronic. Many of you, if you were around Alberta in the 1980s, or maybe your parents were, I was watching a lot of Love Boat and MASH in the 1980s. I wasn't too concerned about unemployment. But in the 1980s in Alberta, many people were unemployed chronically. It wasn't just a few weeks, it might have been months or even years. So you see those red bars becoming, some of them becoming a little bit wider. You also see those blue bars of education recurring throughout one's career. This was the era of lifelong learning. Training and retraining became not only more common, but in fact expected. There was an expectation that the employer provide some training and that the employee take up this training and be able to learn new skills and develop new competencies. This was also the era where computer technology was landing on the desks of a lot of people, and they needed some training in understanding and knowing how this computer technology worked. We also see this was the era of the weekend MBA program, where you might, step away on your own free time, or you might step away from work in order to pursue education. The important factor is education is no longer ending at high school or university graduation. The expectation is that education continues throughout your life and throughout your career. That was another important shift. Another really important shift is the idea of parental leave. With changes to the Employment Insurance Act in the 80s and 90s, it became far more common and in fact expected that young parents would take leave from their job for a time with some compensation through the EI program, and the idea that employers were compelled or expected to hold their position. That was another important shift. Again, if you would think about how crazy that would have seemed in 1922, but by the 80s and 90s, this becomes a part of our fabric in our work-life relationship. The 2000s, or the first 20 years of this century, well, here we're seeing more complexities again. We have seen a growing rate of caring for aging parents or extended family members, marked by those yellow bars later in one's career. And this, I think, is a really important shift. It's not just now that you would take time away in order to care for young children, but there's a growing expectation that, in fact, adult children, be care providers for aging parents. I think if there's one thing that COVID revealed, and I hope it revealed many things, but for Canadians is simply the inadequacy of our system of long-term care in this country. Now that existed, of course, before COVID. I dealt with my father. He was in long-term care for 4 years leading up to 2014. And even then, I mean, there was this sense that long-term care is not working properly. And then COVID really revealed the inadequacy of the whole program. And we don't have time in this presentation to get into how do you reform long-term care. That's a bigger question. But it is my prediction that in the coming 20 years, one of the biggest shifts we are going to see with respect to employers and employees is an expectation that there be flexibility for them to care for aging parents. If that means flexibility in the hours they work, or maybe taking some time away from work like you would with parental leave or maternity, paternity leave, I think this is going to be a major shift. And it already has been over the previous 20 years. You might choose to take some time off mid-career, as marked by that red bar in the middle, something that academics have always called a sabbatical leave. Now, for the better part of the last 200 years, it was really only academics who, bought into this idea that you can just take time away to pursue maybe other studies or other areas of professional development. More commonly, people might just take a year off work to travel around the world. A lot of employers, including Canada Post, they have programs. Now, depending on the nature of the work, but Canada Post offers a program whereby you can work extra hours every week for 4 years, and then every 5th year, you get a year off with pay. And a lot of people, find that appealing, that to take a year to travel, maybe with their family, or maybe just take a year to do some personal development. Again, think how foreign that would have sounded in 1922 or even in 1962. But more commonly, people are understanding that this is a part of their work-life balance. We might start to see more people, or we have been seeing more people working after age 65. As Canadians' health has improved, age 65 becomes less and less meaningful as retirement age. More Canadians are healthy, they're active, they want to participate. They might not want the 50-hour-a-week rat race that they used to be on. They might want more time golfing or spending with their grandkids, but many of them want to remain attached to the workforce in some way. That might be part-time or maybe a mentoring kind of role. And then also the gig economy shows up, as marked by those 3 bars that I have early in one's career. Now, it's not just young people who would be engaged in the gig economy. It could be people of any age. But this idea that you work 2, 3, or even more jobs, cobbling together income. This is a major shift that we've seen over the last 20 years. Even that term, the gig economy, is kind of new over the last 10 years or so. And I would say there are some advantages, but there's some real disadvantages, some real dark alleys with the gig economy that we have to, that economists and social workers and psychologists have sort of been involved in trying to understand the impact of the gig economy. But I think it is here to stay, at least for many Canadians, as a part of our work-life relationship. And then finally, we get to the year 2022. Now look at how complicated this is. There are a lot of pieces coming and going. It is not the straightforward bars of blue, green, and red as it was in 1922 or even 50 years ago. Today, there is a lot of nuance with our relationship with our work. And watch what happens to the light green bar in the background, the bar I've been calling work. Over COVID, a lot of workers have been liberated geographically from when and where work takes place. Now, this was happening long before COVID. Technology has allowed a lot of people to work remotely. They no longer have to be at their office downtown. They can work from wherever. But COVID really accelerated that trend, and it entrenched in workers' minds this idea that I can work from home just as easily as I can from an office. Now, I think it's really important to pause at this point and remember or recognize there are many Canadian workers who, because of the nature of their work, they cannot work from home. Think of construction workers, healthcare workers, retail, food and accommodation. There are a lot of workers simply because of the nature of what they do, they actually can't work from home. So we have to remember, it's not everybody who can work remotely or work from their home office. But for many Canadians, they have become geographically untethered from their cubicle downtown. So I've marked that light green bar in the background with various shades of light green, dark green, and white, just to reflect that the geography of where and when we work has changed. So have a look at that bar. There is a lot going on. The point I guess I'm trying to make with this is that it is no longer just about the paycheck that workers will think about taking a job. There are a lot of characteristics, a lot of considerations in 2022. Now, this has implications for the employer and the employee. Employers in 2022, it's not just about the compensation anymore, although I would note that remains important. But they also, if they're going to be an employer of choice, they also have to be conscious of education and training that they are offering their workers. They have to be conscious about flexibility with hours, so as to allow their employees to care for children and aging parents. They have to be conscious about remote working and flexible office hours. All of these things that no one in 1922 or 1962 had to worry about at all. For employees, when they think about taking a job, yeah, they're going to want to know what's the compensation package, but they're also going to want to know, does this employer offer me all of these other characteristics that I'm looking for? Our relationship with our jobs has changed. It's much more complex. It's no longer just about the paycheck. All right, I got to keep moving along. The third narrative before I conclude. The idea that inflation is going to drive interest rates higher. Now, I'm assuming you've all noticed inflation. We are at a 30-year high level of inflation. New inflation numbers out yesterday, in fact, for Canada. Inflation hasn't been this high since 1981, or pardon me, since 1991. So we're at a 30-year high of inflation. It's a 40-year high of inflation in the United States. And the story that we all have learned over the many decades is that whenever inflation flares up, central banks, like the Bank of Canada, will respond with higher interest rates and higher borrowing costs. It's a lockstep relationship. But in 2022, this relationship is broken down a little bit, and we have to rethink the narrative. The reason is inflation in 2022 is not as straightforward as it's been in the past. There are 4 factors driving inflation in 2022. The first has to do with supply chain disruptions, a lot of that because of COVID. Right around 2 years ago today, mid-March of 2020, factories all around the world started to go down because of COVID outbreaks. This really disrupted supply chains. We found out, in fact, how fragile these global supply chains really are. When one little component or one little computer chip cannot get to the next factory, everything gets delayed. 2 years later into COVID, we're still dealing with supply chain disruptions. And when those goods don't make it to the store shelves, it creates shortage, and that is one reason prices have been rising. But it's not the only reason. Commodity prices, notably food commodity prices, have been rising, and a lot of that is because of more extreme climate events around the world. A lot of this related to climate change and global warming. Increased rates of drought, of flood, of frost, of heat, of insects, all sorts of things. For the last 10 years, rates of crop failures have been increasing. And we need look no further than Alberta and Western Canada last summer, the summer of 2021, when intense drought and record-breaking heat really prevented the development of a lot of our traditional crops. Fortunately, this doesn't happen everywhere around the world at the same time, but it has been happening with increasing frequency, and that is driving food prices higher. Also, and I'll say more about the geopolitical situation in Ukraine, but Ukraine and Russia are both major wheat producing regions. With the disruptions now because of the invasion and the human crisis in Ukraine, that is going to push wheat and other food prices even higher. So all of this is unrelated to COVID, but food commodity prices and other commodities, notably crude oil, have been rising. This is another factor driving consumer inflation higher. The third factor, wage price inflation. Now, I just spent a lot of time talking about our relationships with our work, and it's not just income that has been rising, but also all these other factors, things like flexibility and hours worked, things like training and education programs. All of these things are essential. However, they do cost money, and many employers are having no choice but to push higher labor costs onto the consumers through raising prices for their goods and services. That's the third factor. And the fourth one, the one that most of us are most familiar with, is simply some pent-up consumer demand, more consumer dollars chasing fewer goods. This is the textbook example of demand-driven inflation, the kind that we would have seen in the 70s when there was just a lot of money being printed. More money chasing fewer goods drives prices higher. But the interesting thing is, of these 4 factors, only one of them, and that's the consumer demand factor, only one of them is going to be influenced by higher interest rates. The other 3, the supply chain disruptions, the commodity prices and food prices, and the wage price inflation, these are not going to be solved when the Bank of Canada raises interest rates. So this puts the Bank of Canada and other central banks around the world in a bit of a sticky situation. They know that they are seeing 40 and 30-year high rates of inflation. They know they have to act, but they know that if they act too quickly or too persistently with rate increases, they could tip the Canadian economy back into recession. If they don't act quickly enough, that consumer demand-driven piece of inflation will continue to drive prices higher. So it's a bit of a dilemma for them. Now, we did see the Bank of Canada on March 2nd raise interest rates for the first time in many years. Yesterday, we saw the US Federal Reserve follow suit, and they raised interest rates by 25 basis points. But there's been a lot of impatience. A lot of economists, a lot of politicians, especially politicians, have been a bit impatient with central banks, saying, what are you waiting for? Hurry up and raise rates, because inflation is, and I'm using air quotes, out of control at 5 or 5.5%. But the central bank knows that it's a timing game. They have to get the timing of this just right. And while I do expect interest rates will continue to rise throughout 2022, we'll probably see 4 more rate increases between now and next March. Interest rate increases, I believe, are not going to come as quickly or aggressively as they would have in previous eras of inflation, like the 1980s or 1990s. I think central banks are going to be more measured, making sure that they don't raise them too quickly, all because they understand that there's all these factors driving inflation that are not going to be influenced by higher interest rates. So it's an interesting spot they're in, but that rewrites the story for where we see inflation and interest rates going this year. So just to summarize and wrap up, it's the creative, innovative, and educated labor. That's what drives wealth creation in our resource sector. It's not the resource in the ground itself. Employment in 2022 is about fulfillment and flexibility. And it has become just as much about that as it has become about the income or the paycheck. Our relationship has become much more complex. And inflation pressures may be here to stay for a while, but the Bank of Canada will likely be reacting less aggressively than they would in previous bouts of inflation. So with that, just to wrap up our economic outlook for 2022 and 2023, we are expecting real GDP growth this year of 4.5%, followed by 3% next year. And I want to put a little asterisk beside this. I always feel a bit uncomfortable talking about GDP growth rates because in my 30 years of being an economist, I've actually come to see the GDP as not a really meaningful indicator of progress. It's really just the amount of stuff we're producing. So I always caution us, let's not focus too much on the rate of growth of the GDP. Let's instead look for better indicators of social progress and human progress. Nonetheless, the GDP is the best measure of the size of the economy that we have, and we're expecting not bad growth. 4.5% in a normal year would be a really good rate of growth. However, 2022, as 2021, these were not ordinary years. These are years rebounding from the year 2020, when the provincial economy contracted by 8%, a record-setting drop in any single year, obviously because of COVID. So we've had a lot of catching up to do. This rebound that we saw last year and this year, it sounds good, but in fact, our economy, it'll take until the middle of this year for our economy in Alberta to return to pre-COVID levels. So if you think about that, even though our economy right now is growing at 4.5%, the reason most Albertans don't really feel like this is a boom time is because our economy is still smaller than it was before COVID dug in. And the growth we're going to see next year returning to more moderate rates of growth. The unemployment rate this year, we expect to remain disappointingly stuck, probably around 7%, which is far too high, particularly for Alberta, where more traditionally it's been around 4.5%. Calgary at the moment has the highest unemployment rate of any major Canadian city, and Alberta has the highest provincial rate outside of the East Coast. The reason we're not expecting the unemployment rate to drop too much is even though we are expecting some good job creation, that is going to be matched by people returning to the labor market. So during COVID, a lot of people dropped out of the labor force. They just stopped looking for work altogether. Many people left Alberta. And if your labor force shrinks, it acts to sort of keep the unemployment rate contained. But in 2022, with more jobs being created, we expect more people will re-enter the job market and start looking for work again. And that will act to keep the unemployment rate stubbornly stuck around 7%. Growth is going to be concentrated in a bunch of sectors: the technology and digital sector, agriculture and agri-foods. Now, I do have to put a little asterisk beside agriculture because it's been a tough go of it. 2021, as I mentioned, was a terrible year for agriculture. This year, we are expecting better growing conditions, but we don't know at this point. As any good farmer will tell you, you don't count it until it's in the bin. And even then, you better not count it until you actually sell it. We've got a long way to go between now and harvest. A lot could still happen. At the moment, it seems like moisture levels are okay. We need some more snow and rain, especially here in southern Alberta, but they look decent. Prices are fantastic. Now, I'll say more about that when I talk about Ukraine. The price environment is fantastic. If we get a decent growing season, it should be a good year for agriculture, but there's always a lot of unknowns. Tourism is returning. Renewable energy and clean energy technology, two real growth industries, largely because of what I was talking about earlier, about moving towards a net zero carbon future and the creative, innovative ideas. Our traditional oil and gas sector, traditional oil and gas extraction, is not a growth industry. Despite the fact that prices are through the roof at the moment, we are actually not expecting a lot of growth. Capital spending in oil and gas exploration and development, it will be up about 20% from last year, but last year and 2020 were really low bars, almost historic lows, pardon me, obviously because of COVID. So even a 20% increase in capital spending puts spending in the oil and gas sector far below where it would have been in 2013, 2014. And we're not expecting a lot of new hiring in oil and gas. So the growth is going to be concentrated in these other sectors. Pardon me, I need a sip of my water here. There are, however, some risks to our somewhat rosy forecast of 4.5%. And at this point, my economics team and I, we're meeting almost daily. Like, we're really kind of stuck right now. Like, do we redo the forecast in light of everything going on? How much information will we know if we wait a week? It's a really complicated time, but there's a lot of risks. Obviously, the geopolitical situation in Ukraine and Russia. And I want to pause at this moment to make it clear, I feel really uncomfortable talking about the crisis and the atrocity in Ukraine as a disruption to my economic forecast, because I think we must look at the situation in Ukraine as the humanitarian crisis that it is. There is nothing happy coming out of this story at all. And that is the way I think we need to focus on it. Nonetheless, it does pose some interesting challenges to, how do we forecast our economy here in Alberta and in Canada? So I don't like the idea of, talking about it as a disruption or a risk to my forecast, but it does pose a risk. We don't know ultimately what is going to happen in Ukraine. I'm not a geopolitical expert. I listen to as many as I can. A lot of the consensus is this war and this invasion is not going to end soon. It could, in fact, be followed by other invasions of other sovereign countries, in which case, the scenario becomes darker and darker. At the moment, we can't build any of that into our forecast because it's all sort of hypothetical. We don't know where this is going to go, but we are watching very closely. The biggest risk, obviously, is that geopolitical, this war, this invasion, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, draws down economic activity in the US, or more broadly, the global economy. Certainly the European economy is having a challenge because of this. And if we see the global economy slowing down, without question, that will impact us here in Canada and Alberta. Oil prices, and I could also add to this, wheat prices and other agricultural prices. This is a really uncomfortable double-edged sword for Alberta, because on the one hand, there's no question, $100 oil is a benefit to the provincial government's coffers. It's a benefit to our oil and gas producers in this province. Now, there are downsides, of course. $100 oil, all of us are seeing this at the gas pump, filling up our vehicles. It's going to make a lot of, especially low-income families, a lot of really uncomfortable choices. Do we fill up the car or do we buy food? Both of which are seeing, these huge price increases. So it's not unequivocally good news for Alberta, $100 oil. For many people, $100 oil is a benefit, but for many, it is going to pose a challenge. And I always remind us, with oil at $100 a barrel, the temptation in Alberta is to pop the champagne. But I really caution us not to. For one thing, as I was kind of saying earlier, the reason oil is at $100 a barrel is because of this atrocity, this Russian aggression, and we shouldn't be celebrating that. The other reason that we shouldn't be celebrating is that anytime you see oil price spiking higher, that is short-term gain, but for inevitable medium and long-term pain, because we know how this story goes in Alberta. Oil prices spike high, but the higher they spike and the more quickly they spike, the harder the drop on the downside, and there will be a downside to this. So it really just sort of locks us into this roller coaster commodity price boom and bust economy. And I don't think there's a lot of benefit from that. We don't get to pick oil prices, of course, but if I did get to pick an oil price, I would pick probably something like $60 or $70 a barrel with stability. We don't have that stability today. We are seeing high prices, but that is going to be followed at some point by an oil price drop. And then finally, and I am actually quite pleased at this point that COVID has fallen to the fourth most important thing to talk about instead of the only thing to talk about. But we still need to talk about that little virus called COVID-19. We don't know its next move. All indications appear that we are on the downside of the Omicron wave. Restrictions, of course, in the province have been lifted. Most places around the world are lifting restrictions. It looks like good news, but if COVID has taught us anything, is that it's an unpredictable little virus. And the possibility of a sixth wave, we cannot entirely discount that possibility. Now, I want to make it clear, it is not in my forecast that we are going to see a future wave of the pandemic, at least a really disruptive wave of the pandemic. So that's not my forecast, but it hangs there as a risk, something that we need to keep an eye on that could, in fact, change our forecast in the future. So with all of those risks, this is our forecast. Probably a pretty good year, but there's a lot going on, a lot of really sad things going on, which makes, celebrating 4.5% growth kind of difficult and kind of awkward. With that, I want to thank you for listening. I do want to take 20 more seconds and plug my podcast, which is called The Future Of. As was said in the introduction, it's a podcast. It's now going into its fourth season in the summer. We're just wrapping up season 3. We talk about everything: the future of cities, the future of agriculture, the future of art and culture. I get to interview a really interesting, knowledgeable guest on every episode. If podcasting is the way you like to get your information, I invite you to check it out. You can listen online at atb.com/thefutureof, or you can search The Future Of on any of your favorite podcast apps. And with that, I have gone on far longer, I think, than I planned, but I think we still have lots of time if there are questions or comments of your own. I always love hearing those too.
Thanks very much, Todd. That was great. Yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to either unmute yourself and step into the spotlight, or you can also post them in the chat if you'd like, and I'd be happy to read those out. We learned in the previous session that you have to wait for 10 seconds to give people a chance to speak, even if it seems awkward. Yes, Pilar.
Multitasking, lowering hand and turning on volume. Thank you so much, Todd. That was just fantastic. Could you comment on what you think the impact might be around the UCP leadership change, potential change, the provincial election, anything in that area that might impact our economy future?
I'd love to. However, because ATB is a Crown corporation, I can't talk about politics. And I'm not trying to dodge the question because I'd love to get into it. That said, so I can't really comment too much about it. But that said, I also do believe, politics and economics, it's not, they're not completely separate worlds, but in many cases, I think we give politicians both too much credit and too much blame for what goes on. In many cases, the economy is going to do what it's going to do, almost regardless of what government or what leader is in charge. That's not to say good policy doesn't matter, because good policy does matter. But I think sometimes it matters a little bit less than we think. So I'm not trying to dodge the question too much. Obviously, this is on a lot of people's minds in Alberta right now. A lot of choices that party is going to be making in April. So we'll see where it all goes. But with that, I can't say too much more. Sorry. I'd love to.
Anyone else? Oh, yes, please. Wendy, go ahead.
I was just wondering, do you think, and maybe this is bordering on the line of politics, but they keep talking about rebates or helping with electrical and gas prices and things like that. Do you think that that's a public policy that is worthwhile coming in, or would it make a difference at all? Or could it be just seen as game playing?
Well, I mean, I guess the cynic would see this as this is just playing games and, trying to gain favor with the voters. But I do think, if I were to do it, I'm not against the rebate. If I were doing it, I would maybe try to be a bit more targeted with people who need the rebate. There's a lot of people who, to be honest, don't need the rebate. They could make some choices in some of their spending decisions. I would be more likely to want to target those rebates to the lowest income and the most vulnerable fixed income kinds of people in Alberta. But I do think it's an appropriate response given the fact that it does represent a windfall of cash for the province, and it does represent a very sudden and unexpected increase in heating bills and electricity bills for Albertans. So I'm not against the rebate program in principle. I probably would have just been a little more targeted with it.
I think Karen is next. Karen Keeler.
Thanks. One of the things I've said to my staff over the last year is work is not a place and vacation is not a trip. But I wonder if you have any prediction or how employers handle this hybrid work and the flexibility. Like, what's your prediction? How's that going to look in 5 years? Employers that are like, you must work on, at a place, like how is that going to look? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And to be honest, this is an area that I'm most interested in right now is sort of the workplace of the future. And I'm not talking about the physical workplace. I'm talking about our relationship with our work. We've called it work-life balance. More and more people are calling it work-life integration, which I think is a little bit truer to the sense of it, because for most of us, we don't just turn off work at 5 o'clock like we might have in the 90s when you turn your computer off and you go home. There's nothing else you can do. Now if we allow it, it just sort of perpetuates into this 24-hour cycle. And I think a lot of workers and employers are getting better at understanding how do we integrate this without driving us all insane, because you can't work 24 hours a day. I think employers are getting better with implementing rules or guidelines around when it's appropriate to send an email to your direct reports and how quickly you insist on a response. I don't think we're there yet. I think some employers and employees still kind of abuse it. But I think we're progressing towards a point where people will be able to figure it out and integrate work into their life without sacrificing those important life moments, but still having the flexibility. I'll use an example. My coworker, and he won't mind me sharing this example. He's my deputy chief economist. At the moment, he is dealing with 2 parents in long-term care, one of them with quite severe dementia. He has the flexibility in his job where he is able, very fortunately, he's able to see them every day. He does have to step away from his work. He has his phone with him in case anything really emergent comes up, which very rarely it does. But he's able to do that. He's able to manage this. He doesn't have to take a day off work like he would have had to in the 90s in order to give care to his aging parents, or he wouldn't have to wait till Saturday, to spend an afternoon with them. Now, it does mean he might have to spend some time in the evening getting caught up on some email. He still has to get all his work done, but he's got the flexibility. And again, I recognize not every worker has that. If you work in a grocery store, you can't just pop out for an hour very easily. So we recognize it's not everybody, not every worker, but I think many workers will expect of their employers some flexibility because they've got a lot in their life going on. I hope that answers the question, but I think we'll evolve in that direction more and more.
Excellent. Thanks, Todd. I think let's take Sharon Sega's question next, and then I will read a couple things from the chat.
And actually, that's great, Jocelyn. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say how, Todd, how much I appreciated this presentation. Really, really great insights. I understand better the relationship between inflation and the response by the Bank of Canada, why things might play out the way they are, and some great insights into how much the world of work has really changed over time. Just thinking about examples from my family. So lots of great insights, and thank you for doing this presentation today.
Well, thank you for those kind comments. I really appreciate hearing those.
Thanks, Sharon. I have a question from the chat from Sarah. How do we lift up ethical companies or encourage socially responsible organizations as individuals and as public institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that has become part of the dialogue, which I'm encouraged by this fact, and, cynics will say, well, we can't trust companies because they're just going to sort of greenwash their annual reports or make it sound like they're doing all this work with social inclusion and diversity, but they're really not. It's easy to be cynical, and there might be good reason for some companies, that we remain always a little bit cynical. But I'm just encouraged with how much more important ESG, the environmental social governance, is now for every company. If they're kind of faking it or if they're really making concerted, honest efforts, it's the dialogue every boardroom is having right now, or they need to be. And it's because consumers and increasingly workers are demanding it. I'm really encouraged by the younger generation. I'm going to be going to talk to a group of high school students this afternoon here in Calgary. I'm really encouraged when I hear young people talk about what they want in a job is, yeah, they want a paycheck, but they want to work for a company whose values are aligned with their own values around the environment, around social inclusivity, around LGBTQ2S+, all of these things that are important to them as individuals. They want to see that in their employer. So I guess the question, as consumers, we have some choices to make. Who do we patronize and who do we pass over? And as workers, as employees, I think we have choices to make. Do you go and work for that company even though they are unethical, or how do you make a choice around that? So I'm encouraged the direction it's moving, but we've got a long way to go yet.
This next one's a comment from Robin. I think it's important to recognize that Canada Action is a very powerful industry lobby group and not a reliable or objective source of information on the energy industry.
Yes.
And then this next one is from Laurel. While I appreciate the examples you gave of potential growth industries for Alberta, the areas where people left the labor force over the last 2 years aren't exactly directly compatible. So for example, service industry, warehouse work, etc. It will require significant retraining and education for those people to jump into industries like clean energy and tech. How do you see the path forward for this, especially with skyrocketing education costs? We also haven't adequately addressed the reasons why they left those industries in the first place. So wages, childcare, job security, sick time, etc.
Yeah, a lot of really great points in that question. And this is kind of what has economists like me, in some ways scratching our heads. I think over time the labor market will adjust, but that's cold comfort to, tell somebody right now who is stuck without a job and they're stuck with the wrong skill sets. It's not everyone can just go and work in clean tech or in agriculture or in food processing. It's a skill set. I think it really emphasizes as we move forward, and I'm going to drive this home with the high school students when I talk to them this afternoon. The more flexible your set of skills and competencies, the better off you're going to be. In the 20th century, when I went to university, and a lot of people, it was all around, you have to really hone in on a specific skill. And you have to, spend 4 years studying that one discipline, and then you come out and now you practice that discipline. If it's accounting or if it's, geophysics or economics or nursing. But in the 21st century, now it's flexibility and skill sets. So that geophysicist might find herself or himself without the right skill sets for what's needed in 2022. And it does create this mismatch. There are, this is part of the reason we've got 7% unemployment, is because we've got a lot of people out there with really specific skills that aren't needed or not needed in the same way. So flexibility moving forward, having a really diverse set of skills, micro-credentialing, I think, is going to become much more popular when we think about education. In some ways, I think we need to blow up the idea of the 4-year university degree. Maybe not get away with it entirely, but do away with it in the sense that it sounds final, like it sounds, I've completed my degree. Well, no, you've really only just started learning. And that learning is going to carry on with you for the rest of your life. And you have to be constantly learning new skills and new attributes. So let's not get so hung up on a 4-year degree. That's the 20th century model. And that model had been around for 500 years before that. But in the 21st century, it has to be much more nimble and flexible and adaptable is going to be the powerful currency rather than how many degrees you might have.
Excellent. Thank you. That was very interesting. Next, we have Jason has his hand up. Go ahead, Jason.
Before I get to my question, I just want to say I really appreciate your comments on the Ukraine. My wife's parents are from the Ukraine, and just wanted to say I really appreciate that, because starting to see that this might be, good news for Alberta, and just really wanted to say I appreciate that. My question is about your narrative of work and labor, because it happens within a larger story, a larger narrative of labor within the automation in the world. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said that 40% of Canadian jobs are at risk of automation or changing significantly as a result of automation. And there are going to be some skills that are still necessary. Creativity, compassion, strategy, those are 3 things that come to mind. But you're also talking about the structurally unemployed and whether or not they'll be able to access training and upskilling and those kinds of things. So how does this play into your first narrative, that it's not really the oil and the gas and the resources, but it's the labor, especially when this labor is replaced by, and I don't know how fast it's happening, you know, how fast it will happen in certain industries. It certainly has happened. We've seen it happen. It is happening for even like low skilled and some high skilled jobs, right? So how does that change the narrative? How does it affect your narrative? Hopefully that question makes sense. And thanks again, Todd.
No, it's a great question, and it's another one of those questions that has economists sort of wringing their hands, you know, worried about what happens. And there's two ways of thinking about this. I mean, one is a kind of an optimistic way, and that story goes, you know, the history of the last 400 years of economic progress has always been about a technological innovation that arrives, and it throws a lot of people out of work temporarily. But the labor market adjusts generally more quickly than we think it's going to, and everything is just fine. That's the optimistic story. The more pessimistic story is things like automation and artificial intelligence is not the same as a steam engine. We're not just replacing muscle power anymore and the back-breaking work of laborers. We're now replacing, you know, in some senses, the gray matter or the thinking potential of workers. And maybe this is something different. Maybe this is not, this story has been told 100 times. Maybe this time it really is different, because what they promise or threaten, I don't know how you look at it, but the potential of AI, you know, could be that it throws knowledge workers out of work, not just, you know, the physical laborers. So where this all goes, I'm not sure. I tend to be, maybe because it's part of my nature, I tend to be more the optimist on this side of it. I do think that in the very short term, we need to be aware of the job displacement that is likely to happen. That's why I've, in some ways, have advocated at different points for some sort of a universal basic income. At least for those workers who find themselves immediately out of work, but without the skills or maybe education to, you know, just become a web designer, because that's not the reality for many of those workers, and they're going to need some support. So I think if we have those supports in place, and if we are really conscious as we, you know, to instill in young people, it's not about training to get one specific job. It's getting back to my previous comments. It's about training to do any number of different jobs as the need arises, to be flexible and adaptable in your attributes. I think we can get through this, but there are some potential speed bumps and pitfalls, which could be very dangerous along the way, for sure.
Great. Thanks, Todd. I don't think I missed anybody. Does anyone feel like their question or comment got missed there? I think we're good. Okay. Thank you so much. Before you go, I'd like to remind you, if you can, to fill out an evaluation. I'm just posting the link in the chat here again, especially because this is an ongoing series this year. We really appreciate the feedback we get from you. If there's things you'd like to see us address in future sessions, we would love to hear about that. So Todd, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us today. I know I really learned a lot, and I know a lot of others did too. So thanks very much. And please, fill out those evaluations. Thank you for coming. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.